Hello everyone, thank you for joining our research roundtable online. On behalf of the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad, I welcome you. We are holding the meeting here on Zoom and live casting it on Facebook. The FB Live link will be in the chat shortly. We would like to ensure that all the interactions in this forum take place in a cordial, collegial, and harassment-free environment. So kindly follow the meeting code of conduct. Please check your username and change it to your name. Turn off your microphones and videos for a smooth meeting with minimum lag. The meeting is structured as follows: introducing the speaker, presentation by the speaker, short discussion, inviting questions from the participants, live Q&A, wrap up and closing. Please remember to note your questions as the speaker is presenting. When questions are invited, raise your hand and wait for the moderator's instructions for your turn to ask. Or you could also post your name, affiliation, and question to me in the chat if you would like me to ask on your behalf. Today we have with us Dr. Deepti Bharthur, and she will be speaking on examining big tech, data, and platform economy. Dr. Bharthur is Senior Research Associate IT for Change. She is also an alumna of the department and has completed her PhD at the Bowling Green State University. Her thesis work was on the policy architecture of rural connectivity in India. She's worked with the Center for Internet and Society as a research intern and has been associated with IT for Change since 2016. She contributes to academic, action, and policy research in the areas of data economy, platforms and digital exclusions, and digital citizenship. She also manages the alternative media platform What Populi and is currently leading an action research project in the city of Bengaluru looking at community-led data systems for enhancing civic engagement. Hello Deepti, welcome. Over to you please.
Thank you so much, Divina, for that introduction, and good evening to everyone who's here. I'm so, pleased to be presenting some of my research at my alma mater. So the topic that I want to speak about today is on examining big tech, data and the platform economy. This is some of the work that I've been doing as part of my engagement with IT for Change for the past few years. And I want to take you through a cross-section of some of our recent work that we've done over the past 2 years, and hopefully also look into issues of policy for the digital economy and leave you with some questions. And I hope we can have an engaging conversation at the end of this. So should I get started, Devina? Is that okay?
Yes, go ahead, Deepti.
Yeah. All right. So just to give you an overview of what I have in store, I want to take a little bit of time to lay out the concept of platformization that my colleagues and I have worked on at IT for Change in terms of what we mean when we think about the platform economy today. How the model of the platform that we have sort of seen with the rise of the Ubers and the Olas and the Facebook and the Googles of the world have led to this situation where we have something called big tech today. We had big oil, we had big energy, and now we have big tech. And leave you with some governance challenges as well as possible policy solutions that we've been working on as part of our work and advocacy at IT for Change. So that's the broad presentation overview that I'll be following. This is the report that we worked on, which came out in November last year. So when we started out, there was a nascent understanding about what does it mean to, there was this idea that there is something called the platform, there is something called the model of a platform, but there was still nascent discussions. A lot of the focus was understandably on content, social media platforms such as Facebook, WhatsApp, Google, Instagram, etc. And people were sort of really not focusing on the rise of e-commerce, the rise of economic activity as mediated through platform models, which is, ride hailing, which is tourism and hospitality, which is buying your groceries online, which is sharing goods online, doing many different kinds of economic transactions online. And we really wanted to understand what happens when all sectors of the economy, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's farming and agriculture, whether it's travel and hospitality, whether it's transportation and mobility, what happens when these different sectors sort of get transformed by the model of the platform? And what do I mean when I say the platform model? The idea is about network data architecture, the idea that these are structures that essentially have orchestrated the production and exchange of all economic activity. And they're able to optimize this and do this so well that they become the sort of the default way in which we conduct marketplace activities today. Insofar, we believe that platforms comprise new modes of value creation and distribution. I want to go in a little bit of detail about that. So how does this really play out? If you look at the diagram that I've put up here on the screen, we see a sort of default data accumulation and enclosure that's happening right now, because nobody really thought that, my likes or my relationship status or how many onions I'm buying every day on Big Basket would become like these very important critical intelligence that could like prop up these systems. There is an enclosure and an accumulation by default where the platform is able to establish ownership over transaction data. This is what Amazon did very successfully for like 20 years. When it started out, everybody kept thinking, why is this company selling books at a loss consistently for like a decade and a half? And nobody could really see the end game, but we see it now and we understand where it led. It was to profile high segment buyers. It was to understand more about like buyer choices. It was to understand correlations, that if I bought A, would I also buy B and C? How much time will I take to buy E? How much of a discount would I like if I wanted to buy F? So on and so forth. And this has thus allowed platforms such as Amazon, such as Google, such as other different kinds of entities to really build a first level competitive advantage. And that kind of has fed into algorithmic intelligence machines, where they're able to constantly keep harvesting data and optimizing based on that data. So what we essentially are seeing is the rise of platform capitalism as this new avatar of capitalism, where in the earlier Fordist era, efficiency and profits were because of size, right? The idea that you have size, you have a factory model, and you're able to produce cheaply, you're able to sell it at a profit, and you're able to establish a successful business. That transformation now we see more in the sense of intelligence, that the more data you have, the more ability you have to funnel the data into good intelligence that can be used to harness your business, that can be used to expand into other verticals, that can be used to expand into new territories and regions. The faster you're able to grow, you're able to proliferate into new sectors, you're able to create new products and services, and you constantly also manage to hold on to your existing network and keep expanding them. Platforms then work to recursively create and consolidate this intelligence premium. The idea that there is this self-propelling algorithmic intelligence that not only optimizes the platform's in operations, like I mentioned, it games and nudges interactions among users and consumers of the platform, and it keeps transferring value upstream. That in an ecosystem of a given digital company, there are innumerable actors that are implicated. If we thought about Amazon, which is quite a common example nowadays, it implicates buyers, it implicates sellers, it implicates small businesses who are subscribers of its cloud services. It has innumerable investments in health, fintech, different kinds of, it just recently bought the American movie theater company, it owns Whole Foods, etc. So if you look at the number of actors who are implicated in this ecosystem, and if you look at where the value really resides, it's very clear that it's right at the top, it's right with the platform, and it's able to funnel all of this data and all of this value into constantly growing larger and larger and larger and expanding into different sectors. And what really do we see, how do we see this playing out? So I have a short infographic here that's kind of based on research that we did. This comes together from research that was conducted over 14 countries over a period of 13 to 14 months over various sectors. So ride hailing, e-commerce, e-grocery delivery, agriculture, mobility and goods sharing, alternative models, etc., fintech. And we managed to see what are the ways in which platforms are able to use this intelligence premium towards intended outcomes. The idea that today we're able to have credit scoring algorithms that can mine users' data and predict their ability to pay, slot them as borrowers, good borrowers, bad borrowers. The problem of panoptic labor management, the driver partners, who are essentially drivers, food delivery workers, etc., who are constantly managed through work and customer interactions data that's used to reward and punish them through ratings and rankings, through sort of gaming them constantly by saying, you've done 12 trips, if you do the 13th one you're going to feel really good about yourself. Earlier we had these ideas of bonuses and incentives that were given as part of sort of getting them to do this, and then they withdrew the bonuses, and now it's essentially all about algorithmic dictated management that happens. There's a lot of information manipulation. So if we look at ratings and ranking systems, for example, on portals like TripAdvisor or Airbnb or any other travel website, properties are listed and there is this host of parameters, etc. And a lot of this visibility, what the viewer essentially ends up seeing, can be very easily managed through proprietary rating systems, preferential deals, etc. So there's a whole host of lack of transparency that also happens in how these results, this information comes to us. And finally, of course, we have the whole nudging of user behavior. Like I mentioned, that if I bought A, I will be likely to buy B and C. If you give me a discount of 50%, I will end up buying F, G, and H as well. The idea that you can break down segments of user behavior and really modularize and kind of see what are the consumer experiences that I can target to you at any given point that you would act on? Like, how do I build a more and more and more and more refined profile that I could then use to sell more things to you, keep you entrenched in the network, and keep sort of having you reward the network on different levels. So when we look at all of these, that was just to give you a brief idea of what we mean when we think about the platform economy. And what we have seen, therefore, is through this model, the rise of what we understand as big tech. Some of you may have followed 2 months ago in July. There was, these very famous or very notorious, depending on how you see it, congressional hearings that were held in the US, where the CEOs and founders of Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, and Google, and I think another company, I can't recall who it was, were all summoned. And this was based on a year-long investigation that the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice had done into the activities of these companies. And the whole question was, have we given rise to these corporations that are so large and wield so much economic influence and so much political influence in different ways that we've lost the ability to effectively regulate them in any sort of reasonable way? Do they pose threats to competition? Do they pose threats to democracy? There's been a lot that's been said about the role of Facebook and how it has a sizable impact on the way elections are fought and won nowadays. How Twitter becomes like this microcosm of the public sphere, and how you have pointless and endless flame wars, or you have a lot of natter and sort of empty rhetoric that keeps circulating in these different public spheres. So there's been a lot of conversation over the past few years about the rise of big tech. And what I want to do is to take you through some conceptual work that we've begun to do on this topic based on our previous research on the platform economy. So just to give you an idea of why this matters and why we should think about it. If you look at data from 2019, and if you look at the largest companies by market capitalization, so how much are they worth? You'll see that 7 out of 10 of the companies are all tech companies. There's Microsoft right there, there's Facebook, there's Amazon, there's Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, of course. There's Tencent and Alibaba, who are very, very large players in the Chinese ecosystem and now have considerable sort of interest in Southeast Asia and Africa and beginning to get into Latin America. And you have these other 2-3 companies which are non-digital companies. So it's not oil companies that are any longer the leaders. It's not infrastructural or energy companies. It's not agricultural companies which are at the top of the pyramid. It's really the tech companies. And this should tell us something about how big tech has become big tech. So what do we say when what do we mean when we say big tech? We're not really talking about any one company. It's not just about one Amazon or one Google or anything like that, but really what I want to talk about, or what we want to be cognizant of, is the corporate control and capture over data value to this larger corporate control digital ecosystem where there is a networked web of stakes based on monopoly control of data value chains. And we've seen big tech become the critical social and connective infrastructure of the economy and society. They are the new marketplaces. They're not just one section of the market. They are actually the new marketplaces. They become the new agenda setters. They're the gatekeepers. They're the public spheres of our times. And because of the very critical role that they perform, they determine social and economic barriers and opportunities for everybody else, whether it's small traders, whether it's farmers groups, whether it's citizens, whether it's small startups and in enterprises of medium scale, etc., whether it's cooperatives, whether it's labor unions. All of them are now only able to determine their social and economic opportunities through these functions, and that's essentially part of the problem. So I want to take you through what we mean when we think about big tech through a series of diagrams that I've created. So if you look at the platform model that we have in mind when we think about a big tech, you will see right at the bottom, there's telecom infrastructure. And then there is IoT networks, the Internet of Things, which have become very, very critical to how data is harvested on a global scale. The idea of wearables, the idea of devices, smart fridges, smart TVs, smart automobiles, and so on and so forth. So you have telecom infrastructure and you have IoT networks, and then you have cloud intelligence services. About 70% of the world's cloud infrastructure, which is essentially sort of the critical layer on which the internet functions, is hosted by 3 to 4 companies, and that's Microsoft and Amazon and Google. So that's a very large part of the internet that stands privatized today. The internet started out as a public good if you look at the World Wide Web and so on, and today you have a cloud layer that's completely and almost totally monopolized by, and in the Chinese ecosystem, of course, you have Alibaba, which performs a similar function. So you have cloud layers which are also controlled by big tech corporation. Digital payments are emerging as a very, very large part of this layer of control. You have Amazon Pay, you have Apple Pay, you have Samsung Pay, you have different ways in which financial infrastructure is being consolidated. And right at the top, what we see as consumers, or what we're more familiar with, are the different e-commerce services, the social media services, content and streaming, so Netflix, Amazon, Hotstar, etc., retail-based e-commerce, fintech like PhonePe, Paytm, etc., etc., etc. So there is a very layered way in which these different layers, these different sectors are being consolidated. And I want to take you through 2 diagrams that I feel will illustrate this better. This is sort of a bird's eye view of geo platforms. For those of you who might be familiar, in March 2020, it was in May 2020, right when the pandemic was in sort of full throttle mode in the country, when our economic activity was declining and into these worrying proportions, Reliance Geo Platforms, which is its digital services division, managed to attract investments from every major company across Silicon Valley. So you have Facebook, which invested 9.96% into geo platforms along with WhatsApp. You have Google, which very recently in July invested 7.76% into the company. You have Microsoft, you have Qualcomm, which works on 5G development and technologies. You have Intel, which makes chips and microprocessors. You have like all of these major companies which went ahead and invested considerable sums of money into this one particular company, and the reason why is because of its spread of interests. So if you look at the telecom structure of Geo, which we're most familiar with, you'll see that there's 5G, that Reliance seeks to be the 5G leader in the country, and for that Qualcomm, Intel, and Google are very interested, because Google and Geo are partnering on cheap cell phones. Microsoft has set up data centers along with Geo to sort of serve a larger, sort of expand its cloud infrastructure. Then it has these slew of apps which actually don't do very well. That's the truth of it. They're, I think they rank 6th or 7th. They're very far behind the market leaders currently in terms of gaming, entertainment, telemedicine, education, etc., etc. But because of its large telecom user base, which is the largest, and because of its position as a very large company, there is a certain gamble that big tech corporations are taking on Trio, right? The idea that there is going to be access to user data at the end of it. Even if, an entertainment division folded up and went, even if a gaming division went up and held, you still have access to all of that user data. You have the remnants of those failed endeavors and ploys that you can just cannibalize. And this is a strategy that Silicon Valley's largest giants have pursued very successfully in the past. So what we're seeing is sort of this takeover of geo platforms through these different interests. And to give you a larger bird's eye view picture of how this really functions, I wanted to show you what the Indian big tech ecosystem really looks like. So at the core, you have our unicorns, which are, of course, Baiju, which has become very large in the context of online education since the pandemic. You have Big Basket, Swiggy, which is, of course, again, a very large company, Zomato, Ola, Paytm, etc., which are some of our largest platform companies. And then you have telecom companies like Airtel and Jio. And if you look on one hand, you see a lot of investments and a lot of sort of interest coming in from the Chinese platform economy, which is, of course, Tencent, Alibaba, Meituan. And though, since April, there was a delisting of Chinese investments into Indian digital companies. And of course, since then, the hostilities between the two countries have resulted in some sort of withdrawal of these companies from the sphere. There is still a lot of sizable investments by Chinese companies today into a lot of second range and third range Indian applications and technology companies and startups, etc. On the other hand, if you look at to your left side, you have, of course, the largest companies from Silicon Valley, all with interests in different aspects of big tech companies in India. And it looks like a very messy diagram. And, I tried my best to, when I was working on this, I tried my best to see if there was a different way to really present this that made it clear. And then I realized that's actually part of the problem statement. The intricacy and the web is so complex that you really don't know where something begins and where something ends. At the end of it, for at least India is in a better position compared to many other nations of the global south, in that we do have a large IT hub that allowed us to develop unicorns of our own and platform companies of our own. A lot of other countries are not even in that position. But what we essentially see is our so-called Indian tech companies that people take a lot of pride in, for better or for worse, are all have very strategic foreign interests that are controlling them. And we're going to see more and more of this. This is, again, by no means atypical. This scenario is very, very similar if you look at Southeast Asia. If you look at like very large platform players, again, like Gojek in Indonesia, Grab in Malaysia, we've seen similar sort of ploys in the past few months to buy up. Alibaba has been making a lot of investments. Facebook has been making a lot of investments. So there is this, Asia Pacific has become a playground in which the American and the Chinese tech ecosystems are competing for a larger share of the, data value chain. So what does this all really mean for, policy, and where do we go from here? I guess that's the question that I will address in the last 10 minutes that I have for my presentation. So what are some of the challenges that really come up? Um, to give you a larger idea of the trade politics behind this, just to, this is something that we work at ID for Change a lot on, the idea of digital trade justice. And one might wonder, what does really trade have to do with, technology corporations and regulation of technology corporations? As it turns out, quite a lot. Because what has been happening since the rollout of the CPTPP, which is the most recent version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an Asia-Pacific sort of like FTA, a free trade agreement that was created to essentially make it easier for American big tech companies to, proliferate, to sort of enter new markets and to function without like a lot of regulations. And that blueprint has been taken, and very successfully now it's being replicated in free trade agreements across the world. We have a lot of e-commerce chapters and proposals that sound very, very benign, but essentially what they do, whether it's in the WTO, whether it's in the RCEP, which India, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which India pulled out at the last minute because of these concerns, and the ongoing Mercosur and EU negotiations, we've seen these free trade agreements, which come to protect the interests of big tech companies, essentially saying, all data can go to them. There can be no source code disclosure, that, there can be no local presence requirements for digital companies. And when you take away the local presence, what you essentially do is give them a free pass on everything. They don't need to be taxed. They don't need to follow rules and regulations. They don't need to follow labor codes. They are not accountable to the citizens of any one country. So that's the problem with these different free trade agreements. And they also prohibit government intervention to set up digital standards for, very important things like e-payments, e-authentication, digital ID, etc. So what we see is at the global level, there is this contention, contentious issue of like how e-commerce is being built into free trade agreements that plays out and really affects the ability of countries in the global south to pursue intelligence-driven pathways for themselves, in terms of what they seek to do in terms of structural transformation. What it also does, and that's something that we've been working at IT for Change a lot on, is it restricts to a great extent the possibility to manage data as a non-private economic resource. Because what all of these maneuvers do is they end up enclosing data further and further in the private control of very, very large corporations. So what are some of the other issues? There is a very serious problem in that our current competition policy frameworks have completely failed to address the issue of data as a source of market control. If you look at consumer competition frameworks, they've been predicated on the issue of consumer welfare. In that case, deep discounting, sort of predatory pricing, running out your competitors, none of that is registered. But now, finally, regulators have really started to understand that data control is really important to break if you want to break monopolies in the tech sector. Clouds, like I said, the cloud layer has been transformed into this large-scale private monopoly. And there is a lot of what is understood as non-personal data, which today exists in the regulatory gray space. I'm sure, since Cambridge Analytica and since the passage of the GDPR, there has been a lot of focus on personal data protection. But what essentially is the reality today is that massive amounts of non-personal data, that is data that cannot be identified to me alone, is what drives the platform economy, is what drives the power of big tech. And that's been completely unaccounted for. It exists in this regulatory gray space, and it becomes this sort of, again, enclosure by default, privatization by default, because we don't have policies that address the rules of ownership about these, the use of such data, what should be done, how should we establish a rule of public interest, etc. Those questions are only now emerging, and that's sort of too late and too little at this point. What can be done? Like I said, probing for data as a source of value in mergers and acquisitions is one policy that people have started to undertake. In Russia, when the Bayer-Monsanto merger happened in 2015, this was actually done. They looked at data as a source of value in mergers, and then they said there has to be data sharing with other agricultural companies in the space so that you don't end up creating this monopoly that essentially quashes out everybody else in the ecosystem. There has been some talk about like introducing structural separation rules that, if companies operate at the e-commerce layer, they shouldn't really be operating in the cloud computing layer, which is what Amazon does. just to reiterate, it hasn't made any profits in the past 20 years. It is the largest corporation in the world today. It hasn't made any profits in the past 20 years. All of its revenue and all of its sort of like the mainstay comes from its cloud services, which are the biggest part of its business. And what, so, we do need structural separation rules that, allow for, monopolies to be broken up in a meaningful way that really attacks the data question. And further, we need ownership frameworks for non-personal data that sort of establish sovereign rights of countries and communities to be able to take ownership of data and use it for public interest, for community interest, or so on and so forth. There is the problem of unequal digital dependencies. Like I've already mentioned, this is a real big problem with the digital trade agreements that have really impeded the ability of many global south nations to do anything at all. Like I said, India that way is in a far more fortunate position because of the fact that it already had an IT services, which is the Infosys and the Wipros. We had a history of engagement with this sector. We also have the largest user base outside of China, which makes us very attractive for market interests, and therefore we're in an advantageous position to bargain certain allowances in these FTAs. That's not a privilege that smaller countries in Africa have had. That's not a privilege that smaller countries in Latin America have really had. So this is something that really needs to be addressed. There needs to be more awareness about this. There's also the problem of lack of data and data infrastructure. So if you look at how really data became this sort of resource of value, it's because governments had invested in statistical systems. And today we're in a situation where statistical systems in the country know very little or nothing at all, and the private sector has overshot them by a lot. Correcting for this, really investing in data and data infrastructure that is state-led, which is a public good, serves citizens' needs, serves small businesses, is really important. And that's another critical policy gap that needs to be addressed. So what we've been advocating for is context appropriate localization, that you demand that data is retained within the country, within the servers of the country, that there is mandatory data sharing by private corporations with public agencies and producers of data, such as producers and workers, so that they have insights and are able to use this. For example, if Uber and Ola know more about how Bangalore traffic works out, then it's definitely possible for the Bangalore the Transit Authority to really get that data and be able to plan better, be able to plan its metro coverage better, be able to plan its bus routes better, so be able to plan its road development better, etc. So that's something that we've been arguing for. There needs to be context appropriate localization, and there needs to be mandatory data sharing. We need to invest in data and digital infrastructure. And we also really need to build capacities of smaller economic actors and MSMEs to leverage digital opportunities on own terms. A lot of what has happened is sort of like hitching oneself to the platform bandwagon on terms that have been highly unequal. A lot of small businesses today that sell online don't have a choice but not to sell on Amazon, because they know that if they don't exist on Amazon, they don't exist anywhere at all. That's part of the problem. And we do need to find ways to correct for that as well. And of course, there needs to be larger international digital governance. We currently don't have any frameworks on data constitutionalism, data governance at the global level. Like we've had a human rights framework that has served and sort of been able to influence policies at the level of the nation state. We do need new rules for digital corporations. We need larger legacy frameworks such as moratoriums on digital transmissions to be dismantled and changed to transform for the new realities. So these are some things that we really need to think about when we think about how do we really correct for the excesses of big tech. The uncritical push for free data flows, that's also another larger issue. And this is something that's, very hotly contested today, no matter what space of digital policy we look at. And this is something that needs to be also looked at in detail. We need to move beyond this obsession with data flows, which Silicon Valley and its counterparts keep pushing for, and extreme localization with a lot of authoritarian governments keep pushing for, and look beyond that to think about what can be the role of digital in furthering human rights, what can be the role of the digital in furthering development, and so on. I'm just going to skip on the taxation regimes thing because I think I'm at the end of my time. Lastly, I'll just end with this to sort of like, I think, end on a positive note. What do we need for a social solidarity economy? One that's not so hyper-capitalist, one that doesn't sort of perpetuate this eternal state of big tech. We need data commons. We need new forms of cooperativism. We need new forms of trust that can be accessed by small economic actors. We need more public goods and digital infrastructure. And we also need well-designed incentives for workers and producers and other sort of small enterprises to operate and thrive in sustainable ways that necessarily don't mean, again, like I said, hitching your bandwagon to the platform, to the mainstream platform economy. So yeah, I think I'll stop there, and maybe we could have a round of questions, or maybe I could hear back from some of you on what you thought of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deepti. Your presentation focused on the phenomena of platformization and its development implications, the rise of big tech and the role of data in today's economy, as well as the way forward for regulation. We will have live questions from the Zoom meeting participants shortly. And I will ask you all the Zoom chat and FB Live comment questions, if any, towards the end of the meeting. I now request participants to raise their hands and I will announce your names in order. You will find the raise hand option next to your username, or please scroll down to the bottom of the screen to Zoom activity controls and click on participants. You will find the raise hand icon there below the participants' usernames. If you can't raise your hand for some reason, please let me know that you would like to ask a question via personal message here on Zoom chat. Kindly turn on your microphone and video depending on your connection when it is your turn to ask. Please keep your questions as brief as possible so we can have maximum interaction. And we will take questions starting now for the next 10 minutes only to manage time better. So let me just see quickly. Okay, Usha ma'am, could we have a question from you, please?
Yeah, thanks, Devina. Thank you, Deepti. It's always a pleasure to know how students have gone and, used various bits of learning over time. And I've really been impressed by the way IT for Change has, you know, uh, it's steadily kind of intervened in this discourse around data rights, and so on. So my question has to do with what you were talking about towards the end of the presentation in terms of how do we intervene, right? How does one, do anything about this huge hegemony of big tech that seems to have pervaded so many aspects of our economic life? So I was wondering, is there, so one of the ways, for instance, in which health as a human right, in another space, gained credence was by converging the health discourse with the human rights discourse. So I'm wondering, is there, in the way we talk about data and, rights over data or ownership of data, is there a way in which the discourse around data can converge with the discourse around human rights for it to actually become something that captures the imagination? Because right now, it's still in this very arcane space, right? So while there are certain policy advocates and actors who are engaged with it, in terms of everyday, and maybe I don't know if it even needs to work at the level of the everyday, but how does one then marry these discourses for it to capture public imagination?
Thank you so much for that question. And I think absolutely I agree with you that one of the sort of frustrations that I have certainly had is the way in which I think all digital policy discourse has been very expert driven and highly technicalized. It's sort of something that's constantly being thought of as in the realm of techies, in the realm of software engineers, in the realm of people like that, or lawyers, more and more we see like being very legalized and sort of entering that domain. And I think there is a real need today to, I think, tie the data question and the rights over data as a development issue, as an extension of the right to development. And that's some of the work that we've been doing in terms of our own advocacy and research. One of the things that we've been doing, at least in the past 1 year or so, is having conversations with different constituencies. For example, we've done intensive dialogues with union federations like Public Services International, transport workers, other kinds of trade unions, Uni Global, etc., etc. And what we've been doing is really getting people to see the connections between their sector of work, whether that's something like health, whether that's something like labor justice, whether it's something like trade justice, agroecology and agricultural rights, food sovereignty, for example. And we've been steadily trying to make the connections between that and the new frontier of the digital, where ownership over data and rights over data will really determine how that fight gets taken forward. So I think there is a very important need to connect data to the development question without letting it devolve very worryingly into this techno solutionism. Like if we look at the rise of public private partnerships between a very large Microsoft is now in our schools, Google is now in our classrooms. We're doing this meeting on Zoom, so I think that's enough said. So there is an escalating presence of digital companies and their interests in very core development sectors, very sectors that really have very important implications for human rights. And it's important that we make the connection, and it needs to be taken beyond the realm of policymakers. And we need to talk to people who are engaged in these sectors, and we've had some success with that. It's easier now certainly than it was even a few years ago, because I think the fights are so there and one can see it, right? It's so manifest. That's the problem of big tech. It's everywhere and everybody gets that term. We don't have to explain it anymore. But even 2 years ago, it was quite a struggle because people didn't get it. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think there's a need to bridge that course. And I think one of the things that could happen to us that I think is more work in terms of having specifically rules for digital corporations in the UN binding treaty for process, for example. Second, I think really working on some kind of a universal data constitutional framework that dovetails with the existing human rights framework for ESCR as well as civil political rights. So I'll stop there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Next, we have Vinod, sir.
Yeah. Hi, Deepti. Actually, my question was somewhat on the lines of what Usha had asked, arising from the very last slide you had on data commons. My sort of worry and anxiety about government-led public interventions for data governance uh, are also so risky these days with centralized surveillance mechanisms and the right-wing governments everywhere, authoritarian regimes. So it's either the corporate hegemony or there is this kind of state surveillance, right? I mean, so that's where I think these notions of data commons get a little more exciting. But if we need to go beyond the rhetoric, how would citizen-led data governance look like? I mean, what are the current possibilities, and are there certain ground level examples in the global south that you can mention that give us some hope and optimism for this sort of third type of governance of data?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's either the devil or the deep sea, and that's always been the question. But I think just to respond to that, I think at least even though the concerns with state control over data are very real and must be, I think, always kept in mind, and we must privilege I think, civil political rights, take that as a given before we get into any discourse about data as an economic resource, etc. I think at least one thing that currently that allows me some comfort in advocating for the position that I do is, at least at the end of the day, the government has, or the system or the institution of a government has accountability to its system, to its citizens, sorry. Corporations really don't have accountability to their citizens. We can, of course, to their consumers, rather, let's put it that way. So that's something that, leads me to believe that, with some caution and, with, of course, all due safeguards, and keeping in mind the very worrying trends we've seen about how data becomes an instrument of human rights excess, I think I would still advocate for that thing. In terms of what you were mentioning, you're absolutely right. I think the possibilities for beyond the state and beyond the corporation, how do we really look at models of data commons? There's been some work that, I could talk about briefly about a project that I myself have been doing, that Devina spoke about earlier at the beginning of the event. We tried to do this small pilot exercise with a neighborhood in East Bangalore, where it's a geography of about 600 to 800 households. And we worked with young people from the community to map data on water, sanitation, and health. And we had a system of controls that we put in place in consultation with community members, where that it's a completely closed system in the sense that it's not really available for public viewing, but it has relevance to the publics that it's meant for. So it's got this water data of all of these households, it's got sanitation data, it has like data about household income, etc. And we managed to get an API based linkage to the water board in Bangalore. So grievances filed from the BWSSB, which is the water board in Bangalore, are automatically mirrored in this platform that is only open for the community, it's open for the youth, and it's of course open for us as sort of like the people leading this particular project. We've had some success with it, but I completely agree that, there is a lot to be done in terms of really taking that commons framework beyond state and beyond corporations. But for that, first, I think it's very important that communities actually have control over their data, and that can only come from an ownership regime that clearly states that, producers of data are in fact the rights holders of the data. The Maori community in New Zealand has been doing some great work. I will make sure that I share these resources. I'm sorry I didn't have time to put together this reading list that I wanted to, but it's been a crazy weekend. But yeah, so the Maori community, a lot of indigenous communities, we've seen like taking from the idea of commons property regimes, looking at like, access over land, water, etc. We've seen them articulate concepts of data sovereignty that like come from that understanding. And those have been something that's, we've seen that impact now reflected in different policy debates. So yes, I think the possibilities do exist. It also depends on how high stake or low stake is the data. Is it something that's, very valuable and has like a market play? Then it's going to be difficult. If it's something that's low stakes, I think it's very possible, and we've seen a lot of those experiments. Yeah.
Thanks, Deepti.
Next, we have Chinar. Yeah, hi. So
Yeah.
Chinar is a PhD student in the department.
Hi, Deepti. Thank you for your presentation. So actually, you pretty much answered what I wanted to ask, in the last two questions. But I just wanted to ask, just add to that question that there were like two terms that sort of seemed a bit similar to me. Like one is the idea that there should be mandatory data sharing for public agencies, and on the other hand, there's this idea of free data flow between corporations, and also the state may be involved in such a thing. Now, of course, considering that this sort of a public-private partnership, I mean, both of them sort of seem like a public-private partnership that can be troubling. So in that regard, and again, like you somewhat did answer the question, is that one, how do we imagine something like community data? Like, is it a decentralized sort of a thing that everyone has access to it, or are there still measures that need to be taken for security that only people within a community may or may not be able to access some kind of data? Or how do we identify, or rather, how can communities themselves identify that there is certain kinds of data that they have a right over more than someone else? Probably this is jumping the gun, but still I thought might be worth thinking about.
Thanks, Sinat. So your question is about like how can communities establish their rights over the data? Is that correct?
Yeah, or even identify that this is data that might be useful to us.
Right. So yeah, I one resource that I think I can point you towards is the recently released draft report, which came out from the Ministry of Information, Electronics and Technology. I'm sorry, Ministry of Electronics, Information Technology, MeitY, and it's a high-level committee report that recently came out in which we have also sort of inputted, and it's the draft report on non-personal data. So India is actually one of those first countries that has started to think about this. It's a concept that invokes very volatile reactions. I won't get into that a lot. But one of the things that we advocated for, and which you will see in that report, is actually this idea of community data. That, how do we have a way of establishing rights for communities from whose that data is generated, and that can be done in different ways, right? You can define a community in different ways. At the level of a nation state is a community, so a nation can choose to assert sovereign control over its data. That's one way of sort of like thinking about a framework for this. If it's about, like, let's say, to give you an example, drivers who work for Uber in a particular area of Hyderabad want to really get access to what trips am I doing, how are my peers doing, how much pay am I getting, what is really happening, am I being able to optimize my performance for my benefit, not for the platform company's benefit. That's something that they could articulate, a sort of a collective right to that data. So that's one way of thinking about it. The previous, I think, point that you were making about, which is about like, when we think about mandatory data sharing, and when we think about like cross-border data flows, etc., they do seem to be like different. It's a very nuanced and like a very complicated issue. I agree with it. And what needs to be done is we need to have, and this is something that work is being done on currently, the idea of a data marketplace where rules of access and rules of use are determined by some kind of public interest principle. So if it is a commons that exists, it's not that the commons is equally available to Facebook and equally available to me. It's about the fact that my rights count more than Google's or Facebook's, etc. should. It's the fact that a startup trying to like do something which of course wants to build a viable business model should have access to that data and be able to build a product or service. And that it's there should be rules of access that prevent capture. One of the very worrying things that happened, which a lot of people will talk about, is the Unified Payments Interface, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, BEAM, right? It's such a fabulous product with a host of privacy, while cybersecurity issues that I will just sidestep for right now. But what happened was, Google Pay came in and very conveniently just built an external layer over UPI. And it's been the biggest beneficiary of the UPI system in India today. It's managed to do so much with it. Similarly, PhonePe, similarly, all of these services, etc. So we do need to find ways in which our public goods and our public infrastructure have kind of rules of determining, who can use them, with what aim, how does this maximize public interest. I think that's something that a lot of work really needs to happen in. And again, I will be happy to forward some work that we've done on this. I personally haven't worked in this area so much, but my colleague has, and we do have a paper that looks at what can a commons framework for data really look like. I'll be happy to forward that to Devina for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Next, we have Preeti. So Preeti is also an alum of the department.
Hi, Deepti. Thanks for your presentation. I had a couple of pointers. I work on non-personal data and I have some early ethnography. I have some early ethnography, digital ethnography on it. I was wondering, especially because after what I heard Parminder say and what Chris Gopalakrishnan has said about community data, on the one hand, we're talking about a national community, and on the other, at least Chris seemed to suggest that even companies are or could be seen as, the business community could be seen as a community. And it sparked off this conversation about nationalization of data and all of that, with Media Nama coming in, etc. So that's been the whole, those are some of the anchors in the debate. But what I'm really interested in is the idea of public interest and how data and its ownership can be seen in public interest. And there seems to be a lot of conflict between nationalization and the nation's exertion of sovereignty on data versus the idea of public interest, which is something that is a lot more distinct and difficult to gauge and maintain. So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
So you want my thoughts on the distinction between like nationalization of data and the articulation of public interest, right?
Yes.
Okay. So just, very quickly, some, explanatory feelings or thoughts about this. I think you're absolutely right in suggesting that asserting a sovereign right is by no means a guarantee of establishing public interest. That's absolutely true. But I think establishing a public interest, at least in a public goods or a public infrastructure mode, which is one way of doing it, not necessarily the only way, cannot really happen without establishing a sovereign right over data, right? So that's the way that I look at it. I look at it as a building block. I don't necessarily think that having or conceptualizing the nation as a community of interest when it comes to data is naturally a way of thinking that data is getting nationalized. I think for that's where we really need better policies. We need to make sure that our personal data protection, which is still something that's being debated and has been sort of put in this unending limbo, only when that's really sorted out can we get into the discussion of NPD, right? Unless we get our PDP and our personal data protection really sorted out and we're able to safeguard the bottom line of citizens' rights, we don't get into the whole issue of regulating for non-personal data. So that's, I think, one way of preventing that issue. But the larger thing is, I would look at it as a building block. I think nations need to be able to establish sovereign rights over the data, because that's basically the only corrective that currently can exist against the way in which the global trade arenas are facilitating privatized capture. So that's one, I think, it may not be the best solution, certainly, but it's one way to sort of counter that, a very, very worrying trend that's really happening. But yeah, I think more connections need to happen between that step and, how do we determine what is public interest? Will public interest devolve in crony capitalism in India? Very absolutely. I think the scope for that definitely exists. When we think about business as a community, I think not to speak for the not to speak for the Gopal Krishnan committee or to sort of impute much to that, but I think we do need startups and small businesses, or this idea of innovation has really been cannibalized by the Silicon Valley system so much that they do need access to data infrastructure. And this is one way of thinking about, if we really want the next innovation to happen that's not happening under the umbrella of these companies, there has to be ways in which these public goods are made available to them. So does that briefly answer your question? I don't know if
it does. And thank you for that. I'm sure there's more work to be done, especially on this front.
Sure, absolutely. There's. I think this is it's something that's still just. I don't even think non-personal data as an issue is being debated in a lot of developed countries. The EU only in March brought out a sort of a strategy on what should non-personal data begin with. So it's very much something that I think in the decade, Cambridge Analytica and GDPR were sort of turning points for PDP and personal data protection. I think we'll see a lot more work and a lot more positions developed around this whole issue.
Sure, thank you.
So, thank you. We have a little bit of time, Deepti, and I'd like to squeeze in a question of my own, if you don't mind. Platforms tend to gain a lot from children and young people as their user base. Whereas there isn't really a child-centered design that sort of motivates how they build their platforms. For instance, Tencent did make a few changes to their games. You can only log in for till a certain amount of time. You can only use your games for so many hours in a day and so on and so forth. But do you think by linking human rights with big data, big tech, there's a possibility that there'll be some aspect of children that will be put in the center of decision making in platforms?
Yeah, I think certainly I really don't engage with that whole. I think children's safety online is, of course, a big discourse. I can't claim to have done any work on that. But what I do know about is the larger issue of design justice, which is sort of something that, has really gained momentum in the ways in, I think, with AI necessarily becoming a very big force, that you do need techno design. You do need, this is what Lawrence Lessig said, right, that code is law, that what you code into the system and becomes exactly how you will use the system, and whatever may be your legal frameworks, etc., it won't matter, because the system will decide how it will work, and the system will decide how your rights are determined. So I think legal frameworks need to be complemented by design justice principles, and these do need to find their way into human rights frameworks. They need to find their way into sectoral law reform. They need to find their way into new policies and new sort of like strategies that a lot of nations are coming up with in terms of thinking through their AI visions, etc. Looking at the rights of children online, I think is a big part of that work, certainly. And we will need to, I think, really consider that question going forward, as more and more you have I think my generation used to be called a digital native. I think that you were, and now you have what is called a born digital, that you were just like, even my 2-year-old niece knows how to operate an Xbox, and it really completely blew my mind. So you do have, I think, the learning curve, and I think the stages at which children are entering this realm is really, really early. So we do need to consider these questions. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Deepti. So this is all the time we have for today. Thank you, everyone.